Today we will talk about the entertainment of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire during its heyday. Naturally, the main amusements of the rulers were war and love. Without war, the sultans were bored and tried to notice it with surrogates. Thus there is a well-known case when a bored ruler arranged a special room in his palace, the windows of which overlooked a busy market square. Every day the sultan went there with a bow and shot random passers-by, practicing his marksmanship. He got so carried away that people began to complain about this outrage to the high clergy. In the end, a Muslim court ruled that the sultan could not kill more than 10 people a day. Nice, huh? But the main source of pleasure, after all, was the harem. In this connection, the story of Mahmud I, 1730 to 1754, who enjoyed his harem in the most bizarre ways, is interesting. According to the Traveler Flash, among his amusements was this. The sultan would hide by a secret window and wait for the appearance of the girls in the baths, who were traditionally given long shirts. The whole thing was that the cunning sultan ordered to remove all the threads from the seams of the clothes, carefully gluing them. Once the girls were in the bathhouse, the doors were locked, and the sultan had only to watch as the high temperature and humidity did their work. The reactions varied. Some laughed in amazement as they watched the dress fall to pieces, some got angry. I think it is a very cute fun, such an analog of the modern TV show The Naked and the Funny. The surprising thing about this story is that in this citadel of debauchery and sensual pleasures, the concubines in the baths were too modest. They washed in shirts, while all over the empire, in the famous Turkish public baths, absolutely strangers sneezed on the Quran and the norms of decorum and washed in the proper way, naked. Almost all foreigners told about it, because it was a matter of honor to visit a bathhouse. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, a traveler, also wrote about women washing naked in the baths. As researchers say, explaining the fact of the presence of shirts in the harem baths, perhaps, in conditions of fierce competition for the attention of one man, any physical imperfection shown to rivals could ruin the career of a concubine. In addition, this might have been a way of concealing pregnancies, because when other girls noticed the first signs of plumpness, they tried to prevent the birth of a child, which automatically elevated its mother to the heights of power. But not always the harem entertainment of the sultans was as harmless as that of Mahmud. The Mad Sultan Ibrahim I Mad, 1640 to 1648, was most famous for his orgies. It is strange that only one sultan was called insane. Given the conditions under which the princes were raised, it was difficult to maintain a healthy psyche. After all, their entire lives before their enthronement were spent in the cage. This is how Norman Pinzer describes the history of the cage in his book The Harem, History, Traditions, Secrets. There is scarcely a place in any other palace in Europe where events of more appalling cruelty and inhumanity unfolded than in the cage of the Salamlik. The appearance of this room was the result of the weakness, depravity, and limitation of many sultans, which led first to the decline and ultimately to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. 103 children were born in the vast harem of Murad III, with 20 sons and 27 daughters of the sultan still alive at the time of his death. On returning to the capital, the eldest son and heir, the future Sultan Muhammad III, killed 19 of his brothers and ordered the 7 pregnant concubines of his father to be sewn into sacks and thrown into the Sea of Marmara in order to get rid of possible claimants to the throne. True, this was the end of such radical measures. Henceforth it was decided not to kill the princes, at least not at once, but to keep them locked up in a safe place in the seraglio, which soon came to be called the cage. It was a 2-story structure hidden in the very center of the Salamlik, surrounded by a high, oppressive wall. During the reign of Osman III, 1754 to 1757, the wall was lowered a little and windows were added. The unfortunate inmates were totally cut off from the world and deprived of any information about the inner life of the empire. Their education was limited to what they learned from their surroundings, which consisted of deaf-mute servants and the few sterilized women who made up the prince's harem. Although every effort was made to make the concubines infertile, they had their ovaries removed or were forced to use uterine rings made by the doctors of the seraglio from a mixture of musk, amber, bezoar stone, aloe juice, cardamom, ginger, pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. Mistakes also occurred. Then the child and sometimes its mother were immediately drowned in the waters of the Bosporus. It is hard to imagine what that life was like. Probably the only analogy is the solitary confinement in the prisons of some countries these days. But these prisoners were not cut off from the world, their minds and bodies allowed to grow and develop. And some princes, like Ibrahim, were in the cage from the age of 2. Others, like Osman III, were imprisoned for 50 years and Suleiman II for 39. When they were set free, they had everything, but they could not speak, and their level of mental and physical development was woefully low. Those fortunate few who escaped the fate of being strangled by the lace of a deaf-mute servant were to head the empire overnight, taking the reins of one of the largest and most difficult countries in Europe in terms of administration. Not surprisingly, there were excesses. It was only a miracle that after such an ordeal a full-fledged human being was at liberty. Revenge of the world was expressed in different ways. One threw himself into all the rage, and with that sophisticated perversity of which only the inflamed brain is capable, the other tried to erase the past from memory, drowning it in streams of blood, without unnecessary hesitation, using the scimitar. There were exceptions, such as Suleiman II. During the 39 years of his imprisonment, he became a master of calligraphy, dedicating all his time to rewriting the Quran and prayers. When he finally claimed the throne, and with it a life of turmoil and worry, he often thought of the peace and solitude of the cage. But there have been some truly bloody events. Here are just 2 examples. Ibrahim grew up in the cage with the constant expectation that the door would slowly open and the deaf mutes with their deadly cord would come into his room and strangle him. When the day came for the reigning Sultan Murad IV to pass away, the servants of the seraglio hurried to Ibrahim to give him the good news and proclaim him Sultan. He heard the noise of the approaching crowd and, together with his concubines, managed to barricade the door. Mad with fear, he thought that all explanations and persuasions were tricks of the servants, preparing a trap for him. It was only when the door was forced open and Murad's dead body was thrown at his feet that he realized it was true. For a moment Ibrahim was numb, a mixed feeling of joy and fear overwhelmed him, and when he truly realized what had happened, with a triumphant cry of "At last the butcher of the empire is dead," he launched himself around the corpse in a frantic dance. True, even after becoming Sultan, Ibrahim did not part with the cage forever. 8 years of shameful, full of unbridled vice ruling did its work, the people rebelled, and he was thrown into prison again. Ibrahim lived with the expectation that one day he would be enthroned again. And one day the door opened. The former sultan and his concubines prepared to hear the glad tidings, but alas, even his own mother rejected him, and this time he was strangled. Even in not-so-distant times, in 1807, during the rebellion of the Janissaries, Selim III, anticipating their demands in advance, voluntarily took the place of his cousin Mustafa in the cage. The new sultan, however, soon showed his utter incompetence. When Bayraktar and his Janissaries marched to Selim for help, Mustafa in turn ordered his assassination. The assassins entered the cage, and after a fierce fight Selim was strangled. With all his might, Bayraktar pounded on the gate, demanding to see Selim. "Here's the one you were looking for," was the reply of the assassins, who threw the sultan's dead body at his feet. Mustafa was returned to the cage, and Mahmud too became sultan. These are the events of the history of this building full of secrets and mysteries. Salamlik. Describing the cage, it is always noted that it is a 2-story building without windows on the first floor, in which 12 richly furnished, absolutely identical rooms. And now, actually, about the madness of Ibrahim the Mad. When he was on the throne, he was only interested in luxury, drunkenness, and sex. In the harem, they even worried that because of the abundant pampering, the sultan became impotent. But a year later his son was born, and then he had several more children, and the concubines were reassured. The sultan had an unhealthy passion for the use of perfume, especially the heavy, spicy smell of ambergris. With it he perfumed his beard, his clothes, and the curtains of his chambers. Furs were his second passion. One evening in the harem he was told of a king whose clothes were all of sable furs, all the couches and floors were covered with the same furs, and even the walls were upholstered with them. Ibrahim also wanted to be a sable king, and in the morning he ordered the divan to collect sable furs all over the empire. A tax of gray amber and furs was announced to be paid, which aroused national indignation at such a foolish and senseless fad. In his history of the Ottoman Empire, Demetrius Kentemir gives the horrifying details of Ibrahim's life in the harem. When he was physically exhausted and nature refused to obey him, he would excite himself with aphrodisiacs and furnish his chambers with mirrors. Every Friday he was given, usually by his mother, a new virgin, and anyone who offered some original orgy was assured a triumph. One of his games was as follows. He would drive the whole harem out into the courtyard, order all the women to strip naked and pretend to be Marias, and himself, also naked, would run among them with wild roaring as long as he had strength, playing the role of a stallion. The whims of the women were sometimes as good as his own, and he allowed them to take whatever they wanted for free in the shops and bazaars. One of these ladies once let it slip that she preferred to shop at night, and the shopkeepers were obliged to keep them open at night and provide sufficient light. Another told Ibrahim that it would suit him very well if he decorated his beard with precious stones. So it was said, and he did indeed appear in public looking like that. The superstitious Turks thought this was a very bad omen, because the only ruler to do so was the Egyptian pharaoh, who tragically ended his days. Once an incident in the harem led to a war that lasted more than 20 years. It happened that one day the Kizlaraga, the chief black eunuch, saw a blonde slave girl put up for sale by a Persian trader. The eunuch was so fascinated by her that he decided to buy the girl for his harem, clearly not necessary for him, but necessary by virtue of tradition and position in society. Despite the fact that she was sold as a virgin, she turned out to be pregnant, and the eunuch, seized with righteous anger, exiled her to his butler's house. However, when the child was born, curiosity overcame indignation, and the eunuch went to see the child. He liked the child so much that he decided to adopt it. Around the same time, Muhammad, Ibrahim's first son, was born. Since the Sultan's son needed a nurse, the Kizlaraji slave began to bring up both children. Ibrahim immediately gave preference not to his pale and anemic son, but to the slave woman's child. He spent much time with him, playing in the gardens of the Seraglio. This aroused the jealousy of Muhammad's mother, who hated the slave girl, her son, and the Kizlaraga. One day, when she complained about them to the Sultan, he seized Muhammad from his mother's hands in a rage and threw him into a nearby cistern. The boy was not allowed to drown, but the scar on his forehead remained for life. By that time, the situation for the Kizlaraga had become very bad, and he suddenly decided that he would go to Mecca and then possibly retire and go to Egypt. After a short assembly, 3 ships loaded his harem and the huge belongings of the chief black eunuch. A strong headwind forced the ships to take shelter near the island of Rhodes, and as soon as the journey was continued, 6 Maltese ships approached them and opened fire. In a bloody battle, the Turkish ships were captured. The Kizlaraga, who had fought equally with all, perished as a man. The booty was so rich that the Maltese thought it was a special caravan and mistook the child found on one of the ships for a sultan's son who was being taken to Alexandria to study. The presence of the Kizlaraga on the ship strengthened their suppositions, and the Grand Master of the Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem granted the boy the honors due to a future ruler, and all Europe believed the stories of the Maltese. The child was educated, and after wandering in various countries he became a monk, known as Father Ottoman. When news of what had happened reached Ibrahim's ears, he went mad with rage, executed his captain Pasha, and swore revenge not only on the Maltese, but also on the Venetians who had given them shelter in Crete. Although war was openly declared on Malta, the secret objective was Candia, or Crete. In 1645, a powerful fleet was set sail with the official aim of attacking Malta, which was hastily fortifying its defenses and preparing for a long siege. However, the Turks changed their course and headed for Cania, the western tip of Crete, where they arrived at the end of June. They captured Cania and Rethymnon, and in 1648 began the siege of the capital of the island, which lasted 20 years. One day, after another binge, Ibrahim decided to drown his harem in its entirety just for the sake of starting a new one. On his order, 300 women were seized and thrown into the Bosporus in bags. Only one managed to escape. She was picked up by a passing ship and eventually made it to Paris. The terrible story was told by a diver who, after the shipwreck that occurred shortly after the massacre of the harem, was ordered to dive from Cape Cyril to help those who might have survived. Almost immediately, he signaled to be brought up. In a voice interrupted with horror, he explained that he had seen a great number of open sacks at the bottom of the sea, and in each, slowly swayed by the current, stood a dead woman. Having had enough of the pleasures women could provide, it was not uncommon for sultans to recruit harems of boys. Often the lover of the sultans was a boy page who was trained on the palace grounds. The page boys were handsome captive Christian boys who had been converted to Islam. Many foreign ambassadors were surprised that some of their page boys wore makeup on their lips and raised eyebrows, as women did at the time. And they were even more surprised that everyone else took this phenomenon for granted. Besides this, some historians are inclined to the version that Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and Ibrahim Pasha were also lovers. They were together since childhood, ate from the same plate, slept in the same bed, and wore each other's clothes. Impulsively, without any obvious reason, apparently, due to constant dripping on the brain by his beloved wife Roxolana, who was jealous of his lover, killing Ibrahim, Suleiman regretted it for many years and wrote lyric poems in memory of his friend. What would you like to see next video on our channel? Tell us in the comments.